Martin Sweatman, welcome to the Foxhole. It's good to see you, my friend.
Hi, George. Nice to see you again. Thank you for inviting
Yeah,
me.
it's good to see you. And you're in Edinburgh, Scotland, and we're going to be joined today by Miss Steph Mark, who is the
Hiya.
controller of the Cosmic Summit. And people will remember her who came to the physical event this year. She's got a lot of involvement, so she's kind of in Beckett's role today. I like to have a third on, and her being a fine Scotswoman as well intrigued me, and she's also pretty well versed in our subjects. Though we're here to learn, not to teach. You're here to teach. And it's been an exciting couple of weeks from you. Have you been on a podcast since your new paper came out?
No, I've done a few interviews, for the newspapers, but no, this is the first podcast that I've done since the paper.
Well, that's exciting, man. We're glad to have you here, and I think it's appropriate because we've had a long relationship. Your new paper has gotten a tremendous amount of global press. Another reason why it's great to have you on and have you on first, real prize. The New York Times, I just noticed today, I had missed that the New York Times wrote an article about your most recent scientific paper on Göbekli Tepe, which is very controversial science. So that's quite an achievement in our circles. That's what we like to see is people who've spoken at the Cosmic Summit or kind of part of our interest group achieve notability and respectability, even though we sometimes dismiss those organs we later praise as having published us, right? So nobody likes New York Times until you're in it. And then you're like, okay, we're in the New York Times. So have you read the article, Martin?
Actually, George, to be honest, I haven't read any of the articles that have been written on the work, partly because I've been a little bit too busy responding to reporters' questions and so on, and doing sort of interviews. But yeah,
Well,
so
there's something else going on there. Something else other than just too busy.
Yeah, I haven't really actually taken the time to read any of them.
Does it make you uncomfortable to read reviews of your work like that in popular press?
It does a bit, yes. I mean, I know what I've written, and so I'm quite happy with that. And the work's been peer reviewed, multiple times. So it's a good piece of work, I think.
It was a fantastic paper, Martin, and I read it very, very carefully. And we'd like you to summarize it to some degree. I know that's difficult, but what did it add to your current body of work that includes this book here? Now, I was going to pick this book up so I could show off Prehistory Decoded, right? But as you guys know, and maybe some of the audience doesn't, I broke my ankle terribly a couple of weeks ago, so that may cause some awkwardness today. And I can't pick the meteorite up to get the book, or I'd tumble over and show your book off. But what does this paper add to your previous publications and to this fine book, which will always be worth reading?
That's quite a long. There's going to be quite a long answer to that, George, if you're okay with that, because in order to explain, in order to explain the new thing,
if you want to get the wrong answer, I don't want to trouble you, but just give us what you feel comfortable with.
In order to explain the new things, I need to at least cover the ground of what the previous work was, just briefly. So,
good. Yeah, please. Everybody likes it. Yeah.
So there's a strand of research which was essentially looking for the origin of civilization. So this is lots of archaeological research in the Fertile Crescent in that region, and there was this idea that agriculture was or at least agriculture was a necessary thing for civilization to begin. And so archaeologists have been looking for the origins of agriculture, and they've been finding sites getting sort of further and further north in Mesopotamia, and eventually they came to the earliest the region where the earliest signs of agriculture were found were sort of northern Syria and southern Turkey, and so they were bearing down on this question. And then at that time, they discovered Göbekli Tepe, or Göbekli Tepe was discovered. And that changed things somewhat because as there are no reports yet of any agriculture being developed at Göbekli Tepe, and yet there are these grand enclosures, these massive pillars with all their symbols. And so the thinking among archaeologists, or at least some archaeologists, then switched to thinking, well, perhaps civilization began with these constructions, with this, they call it monumentality. And so that perhaps when people built these monuments, that attracted larger and larger numbers of people to sort of gather and congregate in larger and larger communities. And that was then the stimulus for the origin of civilization. So there is this sort of dichotomy. Is it agriculture? Is it monumentality? Is it both, perhaps? So that is one question. And then there's this other strand of research, which is the Younger Dryas Impact, that you know very well. The hypothesis. So that's all related to what triggered the the Younger Dryas period. What was the mechanism for the cooling, and are there associated megafaunal extinction events? Are there associated changes in human cultures? And so just broadly, I think my work kind of brings these two strands of research together because it links Göbekli Tepe to the Younger Dryas impact. And my previous work, how does it do that? My previous work attempted to decode some of the animal symbols at Göbekli Tepe, and we focused particularly on one pillar at the site, which is Pillar 43, also known as the Vulture Stone, and that has a particular arrangement of animal symbols and other geometric symbols that we interpreted as a date. So essentially the pillar was a memorial, and the date was written using precession of the equinoxes, and the animals represent constellations that are similar, we think, to the Greek constellations that we still use today, and they're sufficiently similar that we can still recognize them. And we provided some kind of statistical argument to back up that claim. And then we also linked in that earlier paper back in 2017, and this is also written up in the book, we linked that date on the pillar, which turned out to be about 10,950 BC, roughly, according to our estimate. We linked that to the Younger Dryas Impact, which is thought to be about 10,850 BC, roughly. And in addition to that, there was other evidence as well that we could point to, other symbols that also suggested that there might be a link to the Younger Dryas Impact. Now, in particular, on that pillar 43.
And Martin, I'm showing it now. I'm sharing it.
That's right.
To show pillar 43.
So a key part of the argument in that paper was that you can see it there, the bird of prey, so the eagle or vulture, which has the round circle on its wing. So our argument was that was similar to the constellation Sagittarius, and that the circular disk was representing the sun, and in particular representing the position of the sun relative to that part of Sagittarius on the summer solstice. And we thought that the other three animal symbols at the top next to these so-called handbags, but we think are sunsets, those are the three things at the top there, we thought they represented the constellations at the time of the winter solstice and the equinoxes. So we had quite a detailed decoding of that pillar. We could decode most of the symbols on that pillar, interpreted as a memorial. But particularly the thing we need to focus on was that the eagle or vulture was interpreted to be the summer solstice constellation. So now in the new work, what we've done is that we've been able to decode the V symbol. So you can see above the vulture's wing, so just above the circular disc, there are a lot of V symbols and little box symbols.
Yes.
So in the new paper, we decode those symbols, and what we find, and I can go through this in detail in a minute if you like, what we find is that if you count up those V symbols and box symbols in a particular way, you get a solar calendar, or at least you almost get a solar calendar. You can count 364 days of a calendar, but obviously that's 1 day short. So where is the last day in that pillar that would make up the solar calendar? And what we find is it is on the neck of the bird of prey. So if you look at its neck, there is a V, and this V has the same size and the same angle as the other Vs. And so we interpret
I'm
that to
sorry,
be the
Martin.
summer.
Hold on. Where is the V here?
Okay, you might need to zoom in, but there is
If I
a
want,
V below the rings. Below the rings around the neck, there is a V, just like my shirt.
like right there, can you see mine?
Yes. Yeah, it's a bit faint there, perhaps, but there is on the pillar.
Oh,
You can,
wow! I can make
you
this
can,
much larger. Oh, yeah.
yeah, if you zoom in. So you need to go down.
Is it sighted there?
Okay,
Okay,
so it's
right
not
there.
there. It's not drawn there on my picture. But if you go over to the photo,
Yeah,
that's just
yeah,
if you go to the photo, you'll see it clearly.
yeah. Ah, yeah.
Okay, there it is.
Okay.
Yeah. So there is one more V, and so that makes 365. Now we'd already thought that the vulture or the eagle, whatever you want to call it, the bird of prey, was the summer solstice constellation. So we interpret that V to be the summer solstice itself. So that gives you the 365 days of the solar calendar. Now, this is really interesting
So
if
it's
this is
saying
correct.
that's the summer constellation. Well, where do the V's? How do you get to 364 days from the V's?
Yeah, I'll just come to that in a minute, George. But what I just want to say is,
Oh, go ahead.
if this
Go ahead.
if this is correct, then it's really interesting because what it means is that the people that carved the pillar had two completely independent ways of arriving at the same conclusion. So, in other words, they were providing, if you like, a way to corroborate or as like a check to the message of the pillar. Um, so they had one way, which is by counting all the V's in the boxes and coming up with a calendar. But in order for the calendar to work, you have to take the V at the neck of the bird of prey as the final day, and that's telling you that the bird of prey is not a bird of prey; it's representing a day in the year. So that's the key thing. It's telling you that the bird of prey is
Yeah.
representing a day in the year. And of course, the other method was through interpreting the positions of the animal symbols, and together they come to the same conclusion, which is that the bird of prey is a special. It represents a special day. It's the summer solstice constellation, essentially. So now, how do we actually
Okay.
get at the?
So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to explain how we actually arrive at the 365 days of the solar calendar. Shall I do
Right.
that?
Yes,
So
sir.
if
Please.
you, yeah, so if you, I think there's a little bit of a delay. If you look at the top row of these there, you might want to zoom into it. That's it. So if you look at that top row of these, so this what happened was a guy called John Rogers um, in America. He contacted me by email. Sorry, John Gordon. I got the name wrong. John Gordon contacted me um,
Mhm.
a couple of years ago, and he pointed out that this top row of these can be interpreted as a lunar cycle. So how does that work? Well, if you look, there are a series of double V's, and some of them are upwards and some of them are sort of downwards or lambda shapes. Okay, so in total there are 14 of these double V's. You've got 14 V's pointing upwards and 14 V's pointing downwards or lambdas, and then there's a single V at the end. If you notice,
Do
so
they
on the right
alternate?
hand
Am I
side.
seeing it right, Martin? They go up and then down and up and then down?
That's right. So those are a whole bunch of double V's, and then
Gotcha.
right at the end, there's a single V on its own. It's not a double V, it's a single V, right on the right hand side at the top, above the last box. Yeah, there's a single V
Yeah.
at the end
Okay.
pointing upwards.
Yeah.
So the way that you can interpret that as a lunar calendar is you can read the V's pointing upwards from right to left, and there's 15 of them. And then you can read the same V's back again, left to right. That's another 15, so that's 30 in total. Or on the other hand, you can read the inverted V's back. There's 14 of them. So if you add that to the 15 at the beginning, that's 29. So having this, writing out the V's in this way, in these different directions, allows you to count either 29 or 30. Do you see that? And it's because of the single V at the end. Yeah. So if you count the upward V's, right to left, you get 15. And then left to right, you get 15.
Yeah.
That's 30. But if you count the upper V's right to left, that's 15. But the inverted V's left to right, that's 14. You get 29. So you can
Okay.
you can alternate between 29 and 30. And this kind of way of representing a lunar cycle has been seen before on an artifact, a piece of bone essentially, or I think maybe it was antler, to be honest, a piece of antler from the Paleolithic period. So we've seen this sort of construction where you have 15 sort of symbols and then 14 symbols, and that has been interpreted as a lunar cycle before as well. So
How
that's
does
not the
that get you
first.
to a lunar cycle?
Okay, good question. So a lunar cycle, well, the moon's cycle is 29 and a half days, almost exactly, very close. So if you count the days between each successive full moon, or equivalently each successive new moon, you will count 29 or 30, 29, 30, 29, 30 alternately,
Yeah.
because the time is actually about 29 and a half. So with this lunar cycle construction, you can alternately count 29 or 30 to follow the lunar cycle. Do you see?
Okay, well, this just occurred to me. It's probably not the
Uh-huh.
most profound question. Hopefully, Stephanie has some. Stephanie's more intelligent than I am, so she's going to be helpful here. But just a quick question. That area, I've been to Göbekli Tepe, went there April 2023, and the cultures in the Haran Valley were moon worshippers. 6,000. What do they call them? The Sibians? What do you call
So yes, that's
the
Sibians. Yeah, I
name of
think
that?
the was the Temple of the Moon. I think, wasn't it, in the city of Haran?
Absolutely. And Sagmatar, it's all about the moon there, which I think is very interesting considering
Yeah,
Randall Carlson's speculations.
yeah.
But why wouldn't the disk be the moon and not the sun? That's what occurred to me.
Well, if you're interested in
It's all
astronomy,
moon.
you'd be doing both.
Yeah.
You'd be looking at both if you're interested in astronomy. And I mean, there is a good
Okay, but
reason to be.
why would
There
it
is a
be the
good
sun
reason.
and not the moon?
Well, the reason for having an interest in the sun is because
Mm-hmm.
it's the sun that determines the seasons, and all resources. Everything that you use, all the
Mm-hmm.
food and all the drink that you consume, all of your building materials, and practically everything that you need in your life, particularly at that time, is seasonal. And of course, it's the sun that determines the seasons. And so, if you study the motion of the sun, you'll find that you can define these four special days in the year: the solstices and the equinoxes. So it's likely that very early people would have had a special interest in the solstices and equinoxes, and there has been work done on this question, and it's confirmed that there is good evidence that hunter gatherers would have taken an interest in the solstices and equinoxes. So it's kind of, we should expect to see symbolism associated with the solstices and equinoxes at this time. So it's not unexpected. Anyway, if we go back to the pillar.
Stephanie, do you have any interim questions, Stephanie, before he continues?
Yeah, a couple, just touching on the sort of hunter-gatherer idea, but also the fact that you say that there's two kind of checks and kind of balances in terms of like the bees and the symbology of the animal symbols. So is there a possibility that this is maybe a kind of way to translate between two cultures who one uses a lunar, one uses solar, or one, two cultures sort of trying to communicate together? Is that a possibility? And then my other question would be, would you still kind of describe them as that kind of traditional hunter-gatherers, given their vast knowledge of the solar system, and then they'll be able to communicate? So for instance, this is a final product of how many centuries of understanding and sort of note-taking and passing down of knowledge. How do we get from no evidence of this happening beforehand to this? That would be my very succinct question.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that's a big question. So, I mean, there is evidence of this kind of these observations of an interest in the solstices and the equinoxes and the lunar cycle. So, I've written some papers on interpreting the cave art, Paleolithic cave art in Europe, and again we find that we can interpret the cave art in a similar way that we've interpreted the animal symbols at Göbekli Tepe. So in other words, the animal symbols there seem to be constellations, and it seems that ancient people painted particular animal symbols on the cave walls to represent either the summer solstice or the winter solstice constellation or the equinox constellation, and so on. And that's why you get particular groups of animals appearing together. So there is actually, I think, very good evidence that this knowledge pre-existed. There's also good evidence that people were studying the lunar cycle, so it makes sense to see them together here at Göbekli Tepe. So as for sort of different... Sorry?
What is the current thinking on when lunar solar calendars were developed by man? You asked an ancient history professor.
Well, I think it's there isn't really a sort of a well-established knowledge on this. It's really looking at examples of markings or art on artifacts and then interpreting them as potentially being a calendar. I think it's quite clear. So in the paper, I provide an example of, as I say, I think it was an antler, which had markings very similar to those V symbols. So rows of, if you could find it in the paper. So it had a row of 14 and then a row of 15 little crescents. I think it's figure 5 or 6. That's near the end. So anyway, so there is reasonable evidence for that. And as I say, there's our earlier work on the cave art, but there's also evidence that I'll get back to talking about Pillar 43 in a minute, because I hadn't finished going through the solar calendar, and we need to finish doing that. But in terms of prior evidence for astronomy, I discussed this in the paper, and so apart from our work, it has been there were previous suggestions by Rappenglück, who suggested that the cave art may be astronomical in some sense. There's an archaeologist, Jeges, I get the name, I'm sure I get the name wrong, Jeges Volkovich or something like this, and she has studied the orientations of cave entrances, so Paleolithic, so painted cave entrances, the sort of direction that they face in. And what she finds is that in this particular region of France where she performed her study, she found that the entrances to these caves that had paintings had very specific or close alignments to particular astronomically significant days, like the solstices and the equinoxes. Whereas if you look at caves without paintings on them, obviously they're kind of randomly oriented, or the directions of their cave
This is controversial stuff to some degree, right? Is it fair to say that the mainstream, such that it isn't willing to attribute calendar making beyond the Mesopotamians?
Right. Yes, I think because a lot of the debate, or the evidence, if you like, is often only accepted when it's written. So if you look at the earliest written evidence for calendars, then you're talking about Mesopotamia, so Babylonia and Sumer.
Yeah.
And so then you're talking about the Bronze Age, and and I think so. That's when we know that there were, in particular, lunar solar calendars developed.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not aware of any solar calendar being identified before that time. So this is the as far as I understand, this is the earliest solar calendar until you get to the Bronze Age, and when we have writing that actually documents it. But as I say, there is, I think, good evidence for lunar calendars, and I have one in the paper there, which, yeah, that's the one. So that's a sketch from Alexander Marshak's book. So again, you have that row of 14 or 15 crescents. And it's interesting again that you have this is an astronomical observation, but it's next to a row of deer heads. So what is the significance? Why would you put an animal next to an astronomical observation? So one possibility is
29.
These are representing constellations. Yeah. So there's 29 little marks there. And again, it's particularly in 14 and 15, which allows you to do this alternate counting so that you get 29 or 30. And that's the really...
Well, I think the most obvious thing to count astronomically, because it's so obvious, is the phases of the moon. That would become a part of your life. That would be a tick-tock goes the clock. I mean, you would look up and always expect to see that progressing. That would be your timekeeper for the month, right?
Yeah, that would be, that and the sun, of course, the seasons. Yeah. So there would both be different ways of keeping time. I'm sure they were both known, but we don't see them together, if you like, in the same sort of counting system until Göbekli Tepe. We don't see them together until the Bronze Age. I think that's the first evidence for what's known as a lunar solar calendar. So Göbekli Tepe takes that back many thousands of years now. That kind of knowledge is it's nearly 8,000 years older than was supposed.
Also, Martin, do the challenges and the unwillingness to accept that there was calendar making at such an early date, and maybe that's responsible skepticism, right? Because a lot of this relies on interpretation. But if they aren't willing to, attribute calendar making that early, does that follow the same dynamic as their unwillingness to attribute constellations beyond certain dates? That's another long-running discussion, debate, when constellations came to be, that's also important to your argument, correct?
Yes. I mean, obviously it's difficult to if you have something in writing, then it's clear. So when it's not in writing, when you're looking at sort of artistic symbolism, then it's less clear. But I still think, the particular way that the symbols are written is very clear evidence of a lunar cycle, and then you can construct this solar cycle. The hesitance to acknowledge astronomical observations earlier in time, I just think there aren't that many examples. So it's not really that there's a lot of resistance to it. I think it's just there isn't much to go on. The evidence is quite slim, really. So I don't think you can really blame people for being skeptical or too much. But I think hopefully, with Göbekli Tepe, that might change some opinions. But as for the earliest evidence for constellations, there is work that suggests that some of the earliest constellations may have been like Orion and the Pleiades star cluster. That there are myths that are scattered all across the world that are so similar that in their description of the Pleiades and Orion and so on, that it's likely that knowledge of these constellations originated at a very early time, and then it's kind of dispersed around the world. So that knowledge probably existed at a time when people were first migrating across Earth. So it could be 50,000 years old or more, some of these constellations and some of the myths that are associated with them. But that's not surprising, because if you look at the sky, there are some very obvious constellations, some very bright sets of stars that are in particular little groups, and they've hardly changed over tens of thousands of years because the motions of the stars is so small. So it's not surprising that there would be some constellations would have survived very long back into prehistory. I think that the difficulty is for some people is accepting that the Greek constellations, in particular, that they could have originated, or at least we can identify precursors, let's say, to the Greek constellations as far back as Göbekli Tepe. That's quite a challenge for some people to accept. There's been quite a lot of research on the origin of the Greek constellations, and I think there's kind of the sum total of that is that we don't really know where they originated, but there is good evidence that they existed at least around 2000 to 3000 BC, something of that time. But that doesn't say that's when they began. The evidence is just saying we think that they existed at that time. So that doesn't rule out that they existed at an earlier time. And so what Göbekli Tepe, I think, shows is that at least precursors to the Greek constellations existed, 8,000 years earlier than that. Anyway, should we get back to Pillar 43?
Yes, please.
I need to finish showing you how the solar calendar works. So if you zoom into those V's again, right, so we've got the lunar cycle there, 29 and a half days. So we have one cycle represented in those V's, which is 29 or 30, so that's 29 and a half. And underneath that are 11 little boxes, you can count them. And so we assume that those 11 little boxes, because it's not the same as a V, it's a little box, has a different meaning, we assume that the little box means repeat the above count or add another lunar cycle. So now you've got 12 lunar cycles. 12 lunar cycles is 354 days. So we're 11 days short of a full solar year. Actually, 11 and a quarter.
Hold on, how do you there are 11 boxes?
Yeah, so 11 boxes. If we say that each of those boxes is another lunar cycle, the same as the line above. So if we say that each box means repeat the above count, so then you've got 1 plus 11 lunar cycles. 12 lunar cycles. 12 lunar cycles is 354 days.
Right.
Yeah, so you could say this is almost like evidence for multiplication, but anyway, we won't go that far. So you've got 354 days.
Yeah.
Now, underneath that, there are another 10 V's, okay? You've got these up and down V symbols. There's another set of 5 double V's up and down. So that's 10. And those V's are the same as the V's above, so these are counting days. So we've got 354 plus 10, so that's 364. So we're 1 day short of a solar year, which is 365. Actually, it's 365 and a quarter, but they didn't seem to know about the quarter, perhaps. So when I was looking at this, after John Gordon had told me about this lunar cycle, I was able to quickly work out, well, look, these boxes presumably mean repeat the count, add on the extra 10, you've got 364. And then I was thinking, well, where is there has to be another V. They wouldn't have stopped at 364. They would have known that the solar year was 365 days. There has to be another V. And actually, it was my partner Claire who pointed out that the V on the neck of the bird of prey there. So she actually found the last day, 365th day.
Didn't she have an insight in your very first paper? What does the box say?
Okay, different partners.
Oh, okay. Moving on.
But the interesting thing is that each of the women in my life have made major contributions to this decoding.
Yeah, that's true for Scott Walter too. Right, Steph?
So here is the last V, that's 365. Now, the reason why I think that's very likely is because we'd already decoded the bird of prey as the summer solstice constellation in our previous paper. So it makes sense that this is the summer solstice itself. This is telling us, this V here is telling us that this bird is not a bird, it's a day. This bird is a day, and it's a day associated with the full sun or the solar disk. So it's clearly telling us that this is the summer solstice itself. So that's your solar calendar. And because it
Okay,
includes
but
the lunar cycle, you might call it a lunar solar calendar.
as you do in the paper, in the
Yeah,
title, right?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Martin. So there's a lot of moving parts here. So I guess what you added was the addition of this is not just a constellation based timestamp for the Younger Dryas event, which is your foundational belief and interpretation, correct? But there is also here not a timestamp, but a calendar.
Well,
Is that necessary for the Younger Dryas information, or is that additional? Is this
okay.
just a Swiss Army knife that does several
No,
things?
George. So this is what I'm trying to say. The way that they are using the calendar is to make sure that you cannot misinterpret the meaning of this pillar. Okay, this solar calendar does not work because it only has 364 days unless you have this extra V. It's telling you this animal is not an animal, it's a day. So what it's telling you is do
Oh,
do not
that's saying
misinterpret.
one day.
It's do not misinterpret the meaning of this vulture or eagle. It's not an
Yeah.
animal, it's a constellation. It's the constellation at the time of the summer solstice. So it's a way of reinforcing the message of the pillar. So the message of the pillar hasn't changed. It's still a memorial to, I think, the Younger Dryas impact, most likely. But what we have, I tried to explain this before, what we have is two independent sets of data that both arrive at the same conclusion. So it's kind of like in computing, it's called a checksum. It means that you
Yeah,
have two different ways of arriving at the same calculation, so you can't get it wrong.
that's right.
Um, now
Wow.
the interesting thing
Stephanie,
is
thank you.
what they're using here is a constant of nature, almost a constant of nature. Okay, it would have been a constant to them, which is the lunar cycle. Okay, once you realize, and this was John Gordon's key insight, once you realize that this is a lunar cycle, not only is it telling you, look, this is all astronomical, it's telling you
Hmm.
that um, you need to then complete the calendar, and by completing the calendar, you get this V. So in a way, have you ever seen the film Contact with Jodie Foster?
Hmm.
Yeah. So this is the film where aliens get in touch with people on Earth, and they do this by sending a signal with lots of information. And what you need to
Hmm.
decode that signal is what in the film it's called a primer. And in the film, that primer, I think, is something to do with the wavelength of a transition in the hydrogen atom. Anyway,
Hmm.
the point is, it's a constant of nature. The constant of nature that allows
Yeah.
you, once you know that, to decode um, um, the information. And it's the same thing here. We're
Yeah.
using
Just
the
as we
lunar
set out on the
cycle.
Voyager space.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you know, it's saying that you should not mistake what this is about. This is clearly the lunar cycle because it's written in this very specific way. So that you can alternately count 29 or 30. So you cannot mistake this. So it's a way of making sure that you cannot misinterpret the message on the pillar. That's how I see this anyway. You've got two independent ways of arriving at the same conclusion that agree perfectly.
Hmm.
So they're very clever, these
Stephanie,
people.
you're very clever. Okay, Martin, let me ask you a question that I've thought about for a long time. As detailed by Ben Van Kerkwick and Hugh Newman at the Cosmic Summit this summer, um, Göbekli Tepe is surrounded, well, when I say surrounded, is among many other sites that are similar T-pillar sites. We've got the Karahan Tepe and then on, another half dozen named ones, and then a whole bunch that are not suspected, known, but basically unstudied. Some say 40 or 50 sites. Let's call it 50. Okay. Why did the first one to come to light to science and archaeology happen to be what seems to us to have a very significant purposeful message? Or do they all have that message? Did we just get lucky? Is it just a coincidence that describes the Younger Dryas event? And kind of a related question, did we discover the first, biggest, most important one of these sites, and now we're discovering the rest? What are your thoughts about the arrangement of Göbekli Tepe versus the other sites in importance?
It could just be luck, George. Yeah, I mean, it is
Yeah.
remarkable. You're absolutely right. It's remarkable that Göbekli Tepe, I think, is still the grandest sort of set of enclosures and constructions that we've found amongst those sites. It also has the
Mm-hmm.
most ornate pillar that we've yet found, remarkably preserved, and it also has perhaps the most important message amongst all of the pillars. So yeah, and pillar 43, it seems, was it's one of the first pillars that was discovered because it was enclosure D.
But would it be fair to say that we don't know that the other sites, when at least partially excavated as Göbekli Tepe has been, might they reveal the same thing? I think that would be a little unusual. I don't see why they do it again and again, but maybe. I just don't believe in that kind of luck, right?
Yeah, I
Where
mean,
the
you
first thing that we uncover happens to be the Parthenon, and then everything else is secondary. You know?
you could be right, George. We could see similar artworks in other sites. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maybe
Because,
we've just
of
been
course,
lucky.
Karhan Tepe. Do you follow Hugh Newman's work with regard to the solstice being visible and deliberately so at Karhan Tepe?
Yeah, I
Right.
know. So I met Hugh earlier this year at his conference, Megalithomania. So yeah, we talked about that. So
Mm-hmm.
there's this is a whole this. I mean, clearly he shows. He has video footage of which is it? The winter solstice. Which one was it? Was it the winter solstice or
I
the
think
summer
it is
solstice?
the winter solstice
I think it was the winter solstice. So that
that
the sunlight
casts the
falls
light.
on the sunlight falls on
Mm-hmm.
the head in that um, what do you call it? That pool chamber with the 11 pillars that are sticking up. Which is very interesting, So it could be that was a deliberate alignment. The problem I have, and he knows that he knows very well about this. The issue is presumably the um, there is another enclosure in front of that pool construction, and possibly, or probably quite likely, that would have had a roof on it, and that would have obscured that sunlight in that way. So now there are ways around that, which Hugh has talked about, which is you could arrange, or presumably you could arrange, if for a hole in the roof for the sunlight to come through directly onto that particular, that head in that
Well, I picked that up, I think, in your paper that you agree or are sympathetic to the idea that Göbekli Tepe had a roof.
had a
Am I
what?
right
Sorry.
about that? That Göbekli Tepe had a roof.
Yeah,
Do you
it could well
believe that?
have. I mean, it's such a the way that the pillars are arranged. It would certainly make sense for them to support a roof of some kind, and a roof would be useful, obviously. So why not? It's just I'm not going to commit to that because as yet there is
Mhm.
no direct evidence of any roof construction. Um,
Yeah,
and
same thing with Stonehenge. There's some people that suspect Stonehenge had a roof, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, to be honest, it's not really, I don't find it to be an important question anyway, because it has no effect
Mm-hmm.
whatsoever on any of the decoding.
Mm-hmm.
Whether there is a roof there for my decoding, for the work that I've done, whether there is a roof there or not, it makes not a jot of difference. So it's not.
I think Karhan Tepe is unusual too, for the same sense that I was kind of relating to before, that they dug, and the central thing that I saw when I was at Karhan Tepe was right the head that Hugh said demonstrated the winter solstice was dead center in the thing. And there's only 5% of it excavated. Did we just get lucky and find that the very first part seemed to be kind of central to the story? Or maybe they do this stuff again and again in different ways in each stone circle.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably more likely, George, is that each of these cultures were probably very similar. They shared symbols anyway. They shared architecture, or parts of the elements of the architecture are very similar. So they're practically they were the same culture. And so, therefore, if we have all this astronomical symbolism at Göbekli, we'll likely find it at other sites too. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me that we find other things like this cropping up. And in
is it appropriate now to discuss agriculture in this context?
archaeologists that have been working at Göbekli Tepe, a recent paper has been published where they, actually quite a few papers over the years have emphasized the role of shamanism or shamanism. So they all these different symbols and so on, they think are reminiscent of shamanistic cultic practices. But then again, it's also known that, or thought that shamans were very interested in astronomy. So I think it's quite likely that we will see these sort of symbols that encode some kind of astronomical data at most of these, or many of these sites, let's say. Not maybe in exactly the same way. They may have had their sort of local little variations, but I expect we will see more astronomical symbolism at a wide range of sites. Sorry, you were then
Martin,
asking.
speak to agriculture now, and you touched on it earlier, but how do you suspect, or what is your speculation? What are the options here about the relationship between this culture and agriculture?
To my knowledge, there have been no reports yet of agriculture at Göbekli Tepe directly, or even Karahan Tepe. And so this is a bit of a puzzle, because evidence for agriculture has been found nearby. So there is this dichotomy: agriculture or monumentalism. But why not both? Which is what I say in the paper. After the Younger Dryas impact, it would make sense that people would have found new ways to find resources, food resources. And so it makes sense that because the climate had changed dramatically, so it makes sense that they had to try to find new ways to survive, essentially. Therefore, there's a strong motivation to develop agriculture. But at the same time, after the impact, we can think that there'll be a lot of fear, a lot of wonder and awe, and perhaps the impact or the comets that were present in the sky might have initiated some kind of comet cult or a religion around that. And it's this religion or cult that was essentially the trigger for constructing these grand enclosures like at Göbekli Tepe. So that provides the motivation. Now, the archaeologists working at least I see that as a good way of providing the motivation for these constructions. The archaeologists that work at the site, until now they have been proposing that this kind of cult or religion is based around ancestor worship or a skull cult. Now, ancestor worship and skull cults are all fine. They fit very well with the idea of a cosmic impact. Would have presumably killed lots of people, so that kind of makes sense. So we're not really in conflict there. It's just that, as I say in the paper, I think the evidence that we have for this astronomical symbolism is far stronger than some of these other suggestions, just because of the amount of sort of correlations and cross supporting, cross corroborating evidence. So I think it's probably both of these things, that the Younger Dryas impact may have led to developing agriculture, perhaps among some settlements. It may have led to developing a religion or a new cult or some type, a comet cult perhaps, at some other sites. And then perhaps the merger of these two things was a very powerful vehicle for developing civilization.
Stephanie, I'm going to switch gears here, kind of sociology, but do you have any questions regarding the astronomy and what Martin's been discussing so far?
Not regarding the astronomy. Look, it's just very, very interesting stuff. I guess for me, the big question is, not necessarily why they constructed it, but more the fact that how and the kind of structure of their community, whether this was multiple cultures maybe coming together to share a message between each other about some event they were both traumatized by. I guess it's more like there's lots of questions that just around, what was the motivation to create these structures.
I mean, something you can imagine that after the Younger Dryas impact, it would have presumably displaced a lot of people. Various parts of the land would have been destroyed, perhaps uninhabitable. And so we can imagine that lots of people would have migrated to new places to live where the resources were much better. So, that kind of mixing of cultures and sharing of ideas may have been, there may have been quite a lot of that going on too. And maybe some people could have traveled from quite a long way.
Martin, speak to your reception. We talked about it a little bit before we started recording. We hope to get you at the Cosmic Summit next year, and it's not confirmed yet, but we were kicking around some ideas. Do you come and give an overview of Göbekli Tepe again? And we came across the idea of you wrote a summary paper on the Younger Dryas that did not include Göbekli Tepe, if I remember correctly, talking about the poor treatment of the Younger Dryas event by the scientific community. And what was the name of that paper, Martin? It was an excellent, long, very much needed summary.
I think it was Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, Review of the Impact Evidence, I think was its full title.
That's right.
That's
and then it was the tour de force. Not only did it show that our critics were often baseless, but they were actually manipulating support for our theory. That if you read their papers carefully enough, like you did on air on YouTube over a period of 3 or 4 years, you actually find indications you can suss out from those papers that they actually support us.
Yes,
the critical.
I would say that there does seem to be some kind of bias against the impact hypothesis, and so whether it's conscious or not, some papers, the interpretation of the evidence and the conclusions leads, the conclusions are against the hypothesis, but in fact, if you look at the data carefully enough, it supports the hypothesis. That's what I was trying to say. In many cases.
That's right. Yeah, which is fascinating because it takes a lot of bias to interpret something, negatively like that when other people without pre-existing bias, I think, come to the easier conclusion.
Particularly when the subject data of the paper is about whether the Younger Dryas impact happened, then that's showing quite a considerable bias.
Yeah, it certainly is. Okay, but your paper this time, at least it's been received wonderfully by the press. It was in the New York Times. You haven't read it yet. I haven't yet. It's paywalled on my desktop, and I just noticed it shortly ago. I'm going to go read it on my phone where I have a subscription, and I'll send it to you, Martin. I would like to have the privilege of forwarding to you the text of your own work being summarized in the paper of record for the United States, all right?
Okay, thank you.
And that's quite an accomplishment. It says a whole lot about your humility that you haven't read the press reports, or a combination between your humility and perhaps, something related to public speaking anxiety, where you're wondering how it comes off, and it's hard to watch your own, see your own stuff, eat your own dog food, I think most people call it.
It's more that, I don't like watching myself give presentations either, or I don't like hearing myself talk.
Well, you do a good job of it, and it takes a lot to screw yourself up into doing these public demonstrations. I mean, you did wonderful YouTubes, which I recommend to everyone, where you actually read all of the relevant papers, the most relevant ones, on the Younger Dryas event, and it was just a masterwork of explanatory science, taking scientific papers that could be kind of dense and working them out for the common man as long as he's curious and can stick with it a while. You've done a great job explaining it for someone.
It was a big effort. Then, of course, the refutation, the comprehensive refutation came out not long afterwards. So that was quite a big deal to get through.
Yeah, and that was just a horribly written publication, in my opinion. I mean, there was so much of that you could have cut out or struck. I'm no, publication reviewer, but I could have taken a pen to that and made a number of very obvious standard changes that should have been made. I mean, they were pleading their case in that paper.
Yeah, I mean, it was nearly 100,000 words. And I would say that most of them, much of it is technically wrong. And a lot of it, I think, is very dubious. So there aren't many sentences in that 100,000 words that I actually agree with. It's I would say it's pretty bad science.
This actually, I've got to ask, it occurred to me earlier when you talked about the constellation. Have you read Hamlet's Mill, the entire book?
No.
Has anyone?
I've tried.
Okay.
No, I tried and failed.
I tell you. Yeah. Somebody needs to get AI to read it and just summarize it for us,
Yeah, and I've read most of it, I would say, but it does get very difficult at times to stick with. So I've read it,
and that's a book from the 19th.
To what they're saying.
It correlates very nicely with your interpretations, right?
Yeah, I actually cite it in my paper. There's something else I discussed in the paper as well, is that there was a Russian astronomer. I mentioned this in Cosmic Summit 23, the presentation I gave. It's something I realized a few years ago when I was researching this. There was a Russian astronomer called Alexander Gerstein, and back in about 1990 something, so 20 to 30 years ago now, he predicted that Neolithic people would use this kind of system of where you have 4 constellations representing the constellations on the equinoxes and the solstices. So he predicted they would use that to write down like a world age. And he thought that this system would have begun when farming began, because he thought that the world's earliest farmers, they would have been highly dependent on tracking the seasons. And as I said before, the seasons are dependent on the motion of the sun. And if you get interested in the motion of the sun, then you quickly realize that the solstices and equinoxes are important. And once you start monitoring the solstices and equinoxes, you'll see that gradually the stars behind the sun on the solstices and the equinoxes are shifting, and that's precession. So he predicted that the world's earliest farmers would have used precession, their knowledge of precession, to write down a world age using these 4 constellations. And he thought, at his time, when he was writing his paper, he thought the earliest farmers were around 6000 BC. So we now know we can take that back several thousand years. So according to his view, updated, we should see this system of 4 constellations somewhere, in the sort of in the archaeology, in the archaeological record, and we have. I think that's what we've done, is we've essentially shown that Gerstein was right. In fact, people's knowledge at Göbekli Tepe was even more sophisticated than that, because they didn't just write down the 4 constellations. They actually put the position of the sun relative to one of the constellations, which is what Pillar 43 is showing. And that allows you to write a date even more accurately. Okay, so if you just use 4 constellations, you can write a date to within an accuracy of, say, 1,000 years, which is not very great, which is why he called it a world age. But by putting the position of the sun relative to
I didn't know that. I'm more familiar with that term. What is world age? What do you mean?
A world age, so you can say, well, this is the age of Aries, Capricornus, Sagittarius, and Pisces, let's say. I'm just throwing out the 4 constellations randomly there. I think, so in my presentation, I provided a table which showed the ages of the world according to Alexander Gerstein. And so it seems that is what actually we see at Göbekli Tepe, it seems. I don't actually have that in the paper. I write about it, but I don't provide any pictures of that, George. So it's just an interesting thing, I think, that this was all predicted about 20 to 30 years ago.
Have you had any communications recently with any of the Göbekli Tepe excavation team or other, if you will, mainstream folks that don't agree with your interpretation? Or is that died off now and y'all are at odds and there isn't any cross fertilization, or perhaps you and Jens Notroff have a good relationship?
No, I'm not in contact. I left social media sites like Twitter and what have you many years ago. So I don't.
I know we miss you. We miss you, Martin. You were a good tweeter, and you've been gone for a while. But I tell you, I'd tell you to come back, but it's only gotten worse. It hasn't gotten any better. You
Well, then
haven't missed anything.
I'm definitely not coming back.
Yeah. Martin, what other projects do you have underway?
Other projects? Well, I mean, I'm finishing off some papers right now, which are our response to the critique, the comprehensive refutation of the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. So we have one paper I think is accepted, one is in review, and one will hopefully be submitted by the end of this week. If not, then next week.
So that's big news. Okay.
Yeah, so we've got
I haven't checked in on that in a long time. So that's come to fruition. There'll be a comprehensive refutation of the comprehensive refutation.
Kind of, not quite, but yes, it's a response anyway. So that's what I've been doing for the last year on this.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'd like to get back to writing another book. I think I now have material for a second book, especially with this new paper and the calendar, plus lots of other bits and pieces that I've picked up along the way. So that'll be something. And so and along with that, I will need to do some research into. You see, we have all this symbolism at Göbekli Tepe where it's quite obvious, or at least it's easy to see, and then, well known anyway. And then we have, I think, quite similar symbolism, and I make the link in the paper. We can see that on Bronze Age artifacts. And then in between, it's very sparse. I only provide a few examples of where this symbolism might appear in a few different places. So one of them is Çatalhöyük. There's another site I forget the name of, but you showed a picture of it earlier where there are some plaquettes, that are stone plaquettes that have been found.
Mm-hmm.
So there are sort of like, you can follow like a breadcrumb trail between Göbekli Tepe and, let's say, the Bronze Age, as far as the symbolism is concerned. Now, I suspect that why is it only a few cases? Probably because no one's really been looking for it. Mostly, there are lots of archaeological sites that cover that Neolithic period, and they'll have lots of artifacts all documented in great detail. But if you find an artifact with an animal on it, it's probably just been interpreted to be an animal. And in some cases, it might just be an animal, But we now know that there is a code where it suggests that probably it's an astronomical constellation symbol. And that is, if you have, well, we now have possibly two types of symbol which indicate it's astronomical. So one is the Master of Animals. Okay, we can track the Master of Animals infrequently, so not very often, between the Bronze Age and Göbekli Tepe. So that's something to look out for. Another thing are the semicircles. Well, the full circle for the sun and a semicircle for a sunset. So if you see any artifact with a full circle or a semicircle next to an animal, probably it's indicating that that's a zodiac, a constellation. So anyway, we can try to fill in. We can try to fill in this timeline between Göbekli Tepe and the Bronze Age, and I expect there will be a lot more to find. And I should say,
I wonder if AI could be helpful with that.
Yes, potentially, yes, and it'll be in reports that are already existing. I'm not suggesting new excavations. It's just that the existing artifacts, this kind of symbolic code, has been overlooked, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Martin, there was a popular video from Jimmy Corsetti a month or two ago suggesting that there was a conspiracy and cover-up actually from the World Economic Forum with regard to Göbekli Tepe, trying to keep the information from us. Did you see that? Your consumption of media is generally more responsible than that, probably. But did you see that? You
I
aware
did
of
not.
that?
I
That
did
he
not see
said that
that.
you're the
I
grand
did not see
conspirator?
that. I don't know anything about that.
Are you frustrated? Yeah. Does the pace of excavation frustrate you too, or do you think
Well,
they're
yes, of
taking?
course. I mean, we'd all like everything just to be excavated instantly, but
Yeah, I guess everybody would be frustrated. But yeah.
yeah, I guess the archaeologists will want to do the best job that they can. Um, so, and I think it depends on which site you're talking about. I mean, Karahan, I think, has been excavated. Those parts has been quite rapid. So maybe it depends on
It has been.
which team you're talking about. So it's still a very
Yeah.
exciting time. For instance, the V on the neck of the bird of prey. Another reason why I think that's likely to be correct, it's not just because we'd already decoded it and it was representing the summer solstice constellation, and therefore it's the summer solstice a day in the year. That's one reason. The other reason is that there are statues that have been found amongst those Tashtapela sites where they have V's on the neck. So if you look at
Urfaman,
Urfaman,
does he have a V? Yeah,
Urfaman
Urfaman
has a
has
V.
a
Yeah,
V,
he has a
right?
double V. It's very clear. People have often remarked that it looks like he's wearing a V-neck jumper. But so
Yep.
we
Yep.
interpret that to mean the Urfaman is associated in some way with time, maybe a deity controlling time, or a creator deity, or maybe just a solar deity. So that's how we interpret Urfaman. So anyway, the point is that the V at the neck is a thing. It's not just kind of randomly seen on the bird of prey. It's seen elsewhere as well. There's Urfaman. There's also at Karahan Tepe, the
There he
archaeologists.
is with his nice little,
There he is. Yeah,
his, his nice sweater, V-neck. Yeah.
yeah. So there's also I don't give a picture in the paper, but there is a very similar carving found at Karahan Tepe. Again, it has a V at the neck,
Hmm.
and
Martin, I actually meant to go dive on it. I hadn't looked in a while. In Jordan, in Amman, Jordan, at a big Roman temple atop a hill, and they've got a whole bunch of different kinds of things there, and said it goes back 8,000 to 9,000 years prior to the Romans. There was one of those statues that looks just like that, and I haven't found it on the web yet, which is very interesting. That
where
was
was that
found
again?
in
Sorry,
Jordan. In Jordan, in Amman, Jordan, and it's
Amman.
in their museum at one particular site. And I shouldn't bring it up since I don't have it on hand, but I want to get that to you because there's
Yeah,
another
I'd be
man out there, and I
very
really,
interested to see that. Yeah, no, that could
yeah.
be very
And
cool.
they call him 8 or 9,000 years old.
So we find we
Uh,
find a statue very similar at Karahan Tepe, and just like a year or so ago, I don't know, you're probably aware of this Sheberk wall carving. So Sheberk is another one of these
mm,
Tashtapela sites. It's near Göbekli Tepe. There is a
yeah,
carving on a
yeah,
wall, like a picture, and that shows basically you have this sort of bas relief carving of a guy like the Urfaman, and you've got these two leopards opposing. So that's a bit like, well, very much like, and I say this in the paper, it's very much like the master of animals. And in this case, he's got a V-neck.
mm-hmm. I'll be damned. How do you spell the name of that site? I'm not familiar with it, or maybe when I see it,
Sayburk,
I'll recognize it. Yeah,
Sayburc. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. So
yeah, I've seen the name. It's one, but yeah, there he
there you go.
is.
That's it. That's the
Or
guy. There you go. So
is that
again,
the
you can
guy?
see that he's holding his genitals just like the Earther man. He has a V. If you zoom in, you can see that there are V's at his neck, just like Earther man. So we suspect that he is the same deity, the same thing as Earther man. But in this case, he's got the two opposing animals, just like a master of animals. So in the paper, the way that we interpret this is to say, well, the V's at the neck indicate that he is maybe a master or some kind of deity associated with human timescale, the daily timescale, and the animals, well, they're the constellations, and that perhaps indicates a precessional timescale. So he is both the master of precessional time and sort of ordinary human time.
Hmm. Absolutely fascinating. Steph, anything on your mind? And we'll go ahead and wrap it up and keep our fingers crossed we can get Martin to Greensboro next year. Steph, any thoughts?
Sorry, trouble with the microphone there. I guess sort of one kind of intriguing question is I know that you're in the School of Engineering in University of Edinburgh. I just want to know if you, on a sort of personal level, had sort of pushback from the institution itself or from the School of Archaeology and History. I know you're on different campuses, so maybe you didn't actually cross paths or communicate. But it was just interesting to see what your journey is to kind of publishing this material, and how your colleagues at the university kind of received that.
Yeah, my colleagues in the School of Engineering are very supportive. They, everyone that I know lots of them are very interested in this work, and they are extremely supportive. They couldn't be more supportive, frankly. They've been great. I'm not really in touch with anyone else in the university, so no one from the archaeology department has been in touch. I haven't attempted to contact them. I've had one or two other people from within the university reach out and want to go for a coffee, have a chat, and discuss things because they're interested. So I haven't had any pushback whatsoever from within the university. All I've had is encouragement from my close colleagues in engineering. So it's been great.
Is there any chance that everybody can use money? What would you do with more funding or funding period? You can never tell what rich person is watching the Foxhole and has some bucks burning a hole in their pocket, right? What would you do with some money?
I think it has been suggested that maybe I should take on a PhD student to assist with this, or to keep things going. I mentioned it just now that for my next book in particular, I want to try and track this symbolism through time, starting at Göbekli Tepe and getting to the Bronze Age, because it must be there. It's just a case of putting in the effort and looking for it, I think. So that's one thing. But it's very hard to predict what will come up. This it all depends on what's excavated, and even if something is excavated, you may not realize what you're looking at immediately. So the key example being John Gordon, who contacted me about the lunar cycle, which I was there staring at me in the face for years and years, but I hadn't recognized it. So sometimes it just takes a little key bit of insight, and then that a lot can follow from that.
Well, that's right, and that fits with my belief that there's a global pool of experts that is coming to light now that are not experts. They're uncredentialed expert or differently credentialed experts. And I say this a lot, but you go say there are 500 Egyptologists around the world. I think if you take the other 8 billion people, you're going to find more than 500 out there that know more than every single Egyptologist, just one way, just based on numbers, right? That people have become fascinated with Egypt, but they happen to be a cab driver in Thailand, right? But they're highly intelligent and they're open-minded. And I think what is going on now, and this applies to you as well, you are not credentialed in these matters except statistics, which plays a good part of it. Is that fair to say? Or maybe that's an unfair slight to you?
That's perfectly reasonable. From my sort of professional work, the input is through like data analysis and statistics.
Yeah.
Huh. The thing is, George, you're right. So the internet's obviously made a massive difference. Because of the internet now, everyone can be an armchair scholar because the information is there.
That's right. And it's not the wisdom of crowds, but it's the wise within the crowd.
And the thing is,
they're just
archaeology in particular. It's not like there's any horrendously difficult maths to understand, or very obscure and difficult concepts to understand, sort of geometric or something. A lot of archaeology is very accessible and very readable. It's there will be lots of people who can become expert through reading all of the materials, all the papers that have been written, in the same way that I have.
That's right. And there are plenty of archaeologists that have very little field experience. So it's not like you have to go and do the work of archaeology, the direct hands-on work. And in fact, there are many, many, many more volunteers who have spent many more hours on archaeological sites than credentialed people have. I mean, there are people that go to Tal al-Amam, Steve Collins' site, that have been going for 18 years and have spent a month over there a year. Those people are, quite up to speed on the archaeology of the Levant. You got any suggested topics Steph and I are kind of putting together next year? Anything out there on your radar, or a particular person that you're a big fan of? That
I don't know, George. You should ask me these questions in advance, then I can say something sensible.
You gotta be. That is one that you want to hear in advance. Yeah. Well, listen, we're open-minded to it, and we're putting it together now. We hope you can be a part of it.
Yeah.
And
I'll
thank you
email
very
you if I
much
have some ideas.
Okay, that's good. And I should have pointed out right off the bat, that this podcast kind of stole a term from you. It's the Foxhole, and your original paper was "What Does the Fox Say?"
Yes.
Right? And
yes.
Where's my fox? Yeah, I keep foxes around here. I've got a bunch of foxes.
And you know where the title of that paper came from? Do you know
from the song back in 2015, right?
That's right, yes. So at the time I was writing that paper, my son, who was of a particular age when he enjoyed that music, and I was hearing it all the time. So, it was kind of an obvious thing.
And I forgot when you put this together, that was true for me as well. My son was about 11 years old and just could sing that song beginning to end. It was so funny. It was so cute. And then your paper came out. And I was just like, what does the fox say? What a great name for the paper. Just tied right into it. And in fact, I've thought of using that, licensing that music or using a select portion of it as the intro music to this podcast.
Oh, right.
It might be kind of fun. Yeah. So stay tuned for that as we improve things. So, Steffi, do we have any announcements? I guess I probably should have listed them out. We don't want to bore people, but I know that we're gearing up with Beckett to do a premiere of select presentations from Cosmic Summit 2024 on YouTube. So there are no full, or not even any partial presentations on YouTube now, unless people did some screen recording. I know of one, but we're going to let some of them go. We're also selling them. About 8 of the 25 presenters will be sold through Brighton University beginning August 31st. And we don't want to undermine that effort, but that's only 8 presentations. So they happen to be some of the more prominent ones. But what we're going to do over the next week, or probably towards the end of next week, getting in the latter part of August, we'll release the videos that will not be sold as part of the live stream package and develop some excitement around that. And I mean, it is some really good stuff. And we're gonna have a live stream during that premiere and have Randall Carlson on there. And I guess it's worthy announcing what we're thinking about doing is setting up what we're heading towards doing is regional talks that we have named Meteor Stream. Okay, so a little mini cosmic summit with one person. The first one's going to be with Randall Carlson in Atlanta, and you'd have a small room, 50 to 100 people, and then live stream that at a reasonable price. And we hope to kind of move the summit around at a physical location. So suppose you live in Texas and you watch Randall's Meteor Stream in Atlanta and say, well, I can't make it to Atlanta to see that, but that's fun, some more Cosmic Summit stuff. Hopefully they'll come by Austin, Texas. And we will. Maybe we'll have the Snake Brothers or Luke do one in Austin. And then we have one in Minneapolis with Scott Walter. Maybe we have one in Edinburgh, Scotland, where Martin Swetman comes on. But you would give a good 2 hour, 3 hour, you could even bring in another person, present your stuff, that'd be live streamed. And it would give people an opportunity to get together with like-minded folks in a smaller room and hopefully interactive to some extent. So we're calling those Meteor Streams. And we're going to sell tickets to our first one with Randall next week. and we're going to open those tickets up. Steph's got a lot of work in front of her between now and then with those ticket registration paths, which is next. Hey, well, thank you both very much.
Sorry, I was going to say that leads us to a sort of soft announcement that we may have our full complement of cosmic passes that are going to be sold fairly soon. So keep an eye out for that.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Well, I think it's very fair to add that. Like I said, I didn't plan the announcement, but also then the next week we're going to have all the passes available for the summit with all the VIP levels. It's much more, at least behind the scenes, more sophisticated rollout than we had last year. And so the Cosmic Summit is really, and the date, we'll have a hard date. And we'll tease that now. It's looking around a little earlier than we had thought. We thought it'd be late August, early September, and now it is looking like July 31st and the 3 following days after that. So July and then the first days of August next year. And we'll have all those prices and that date confirmed next week. And hope to see people for that live stream, and hope people enjoyed your presence today, Martin. I know they did. I certainly did. Thank you, man. You're a great brain. It takes 8 billion people to come up with people like Martin Swetman. Okay?
Thank you very much, George. Good to talk to you. And Steph, thank you.
Okay, well, I'll have to read that New York Times article. I'm going to go read it right now, and then I'm going to steal it, and then I'm going to put it on my Cosmic Tusk post that I did on your paper. You can find, by the way, Martin's paper is at cosmictusk.com. Okay, printed without permission, as is our way at the Tusk. Good to see you guys. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, thanks, George. See you.